I need to tell you about a Tuesday morning at Dulles International Airport when my father told me to shut up and stop embarrassing us, and a TSA agent in a blue uniform changed the entire direction of that conversation with 4 words. But I need to start where the embarrassment actually began, which was not at an airport and not on a Tuesday. It was 20 years earlier in a kitchen in Richmond, Virginia, when I was 18 years old and told my father I had been selected for the Naval Academy. He put down his coffee cup. He said, "The Naval Academy." I said, "Yes." He said, "Sarah, you want to spend 4 years being disciplined by people who couldn't make it in the private sector?" That was my father's understanding of military service. Not contemptuous exactly. He had a great uncle who had served in Vietnam, and he spoke of that service with genuine respect. But the respect was historical, the kind you extend to something that existed in a different era and under different circumstances. In his framework, the military was what people did before the modern economy existed, when there was no alternative path to structure and advancement. In the modern economy, with his daughter's academic record and her potential, the military was a step down. He said, "What about Georgetown? You got in full ride." I said, "I want to serve." He said, "You can serve without enlisting. There are other ways to contribute." I said, "I've already accepted." The silence that followed was the kind that reorganizes a relationship without anyone saying the reorganization out loud. My father did not rage. He was not a man who raged. He processed his disappointment in a controlled, persistent way that expressed itself through the ongoing presence of his original assessment rather than through any single dramatic confrontation. Over the following 20 years, I heard that assessment regularly, not always in words. Sometimes in the way he responded when I mentioned a deployment, or a promotion or an assignment that I was proud of, a brief acknowledgement followed by a pivot to something he could evaluate within his own framework. Sometimes in the questions he asked at family dinners, which were consistently about when I was planning to transition out, what the job market looked like for people with my background, whether I had given any thought to what came next. What came next, for him, was always the real life I was delaying. What was actually happening was that I was becoming one of the Navy's senior intelligence officers. I won't be able to tell you everything that my career contained. For the same reason I could never tell my father, much of it was and remains classified, existing in documents and briefings and operational decisions that are not public record, and that I have legal obligations to protect. What I can tell you is that by 38 I held the rank of captain. I had deployed 6 times. I had been awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and several commendations that I cannot reference publicly. I had been selected for a senior leadership program that would, depending on how the next 2 years went, position me for flag officer consideration. My father knew approximately none of this. The airport morning happened in January. My parents had been visiting me in Washington for 3 days. A visit my mother had arranged, the kind she organized periodically to maintain the connective tissue of a family that geography and divergence had pulled in different directions. It had been a good visit by most measures. We had gone to dinner, we had seen some of the city. My mother had visited the Smithsonian twice and bought more things in the gift shop than she would admit to. My father had been pleasant and warm in the way he was when he was on my territory rather than his own, slightly more contained, slightly less inclined toward the assessments that surfaced most readily when he was comfortable. On the morning they were leaving, I drove them to Dulles. I was in uniform. This was not a choice I had made for any particular reason. I had a meeting at the Pentagon immediately after dropping them off and hadn't had time to change. My uniform was pressed and correct, the rank insignia and medals in their proper place, the whole presentation of someone who has been doing this long enough that putting on a uniform in the morning is as unremarkable as putting on shoes. My father had always had a particular response to seeing me in uniform. Not negative exactly, but something that occupied the space between recognition and discomfort, as if the visual reality of my rank and insignia created a cognitive dissonance with his settled belief about what my career amounted to. We pulled up to the departures drop-off area. I parked in the short-term lot because I wanted to walk them to the check-in area, a gesture my mother appreciated and my father tolerated. We got their bags from the trunk. At the entrance, a man was coming out as we were going in, moving quickly and not looking ahead, and he walked directly into my father's shoulder with enough force to jostle both of them. My father's carry-on bag fell. The man apologized, helped retrieve the bag, and moved on. The incident took 30 seconds. My father, who had been startled and was now embarrassed in the particular way of someone whose dignity has been momentarily disrupted in a public space, turned to me and said, "You should have been watching where we were going." I started to say something, I don't remember what, something mild and conciliatory, and he cut me off. He said, "Shut up and stop embarrassing us. This is not the time." He said it the way people say things they have been saying for 20 years in milder forms, the compressed version of a longer assessment. The words had the quality of something that had been building for a long time and had found a pressure release valve in a minor frustration at an airport entrance. My mother looked at me with the expression she had been perfecting for 20 years, the expression that said she understood and was sorry and could not change what was happening. I did not respond. We walked into the terminal. The check-in area for their airline was approximately 40 feet inside the entrance, past the information desk and the first security checkpoint. We had taken perhaps 20 steps when a woman in a TSA uniform appeared at my left shoulder. She was perhaps 50, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular authority of someone who has been working a role for long enough that the role has become natural rather than performed. She said, "Excuse me, ma'am." I turned. She looked at my rank insignia, the 4 silver stripes of a Navy captain, and then at my face. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular attention of someone who has recognized something they were not expecting. She said, "Captain Mitchell." I said, "Yes." She said, "Ma'am, we have the expedited screening ready for you. Right this way if you like." I said, "I'm just dropping off my parent." She said, "Still, if there's anything you need this morning, don't hesitate. We're glad to have you through here." She said it with the particular warmth of someone who meant it specifically, not the generic warmth of customer service, but the warmth of someone extending recognition to a specific person in a specific role. I thanked her. She nodded and stepped back, and we continued toward the check-in counter. My father had been standing 2 feet away. He had heard every word. I want to describe what his face looked like, because it is the thing I have returned to most often in the months since that morning. He was not a man whose face typically showed what he was thinking. He had 30 years of business negotiations behind him, the practiced composure of someone who had learned to manage his expressions in rooms where showing your hand was a disadvantage. He was very good at the neutral face, the attentive but unrevealing face, the face that processed information without immediately translating it into visible reaction. What I saw on his face at that moment was not the neutral face. It was the face of someone doing rapid recalibration. The face of someone whose settled picture of something has been disrupted by a specific piece of information that doesn't fit inside the frame they have been using. Not shock exactly. More like the expression you make when a piece of furniture you have been walking around for years turns out to have been in the wrong place the whole time, and you have just discovered where it actually belongs. He said nothing. We reached the check-in counter. My mother handled the bags with the efficiency of someone who travels often and doesn't need help. My father stood slightly apart, still quiet. I helped my mother lift one bag onto the scale. The airline agent processed their tickets. We established that the flight was on time and that their seats were confirmed. Then we walked toward the security line. My mother hugged me first, the long warm hug of a woman who loves her daughter and understands things she doesn't say. She whispered something in my ear, "I'll call you when we land," and then she moved toward the line. My father stood in front of me. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "That woman knew who you were." I said, "Yes." He said, "How did she know?" I said, "I come through here sometimes. It's a busy airport for people in my position." He said, "Your position?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know what your position is." I said, "I know you don't." He said, "Whose fault is that?" The question surprised me, not because it was asked. I had thought about that question for 20 years, but because he was asking it, which was different from me thinking it. I said, "Some of it is classification. Some of it is that I stopped trying to explain it because you stopped responding in a way that suggested you wanted to understand." He was quiet. He said, "And some of it is my fault." I said, "Yes." He said, "Shut up and stop embarrassing us." He said it quietly, not with the frustrated edge from the entrance, but as a repetition or recognition that he was looking back at something he had said 20 minutes ago from a different angle than the one he had said it from. I said, "It's not all right." I said, "I know. But I've been fine for a long time, Dad. I've been more than fine." My mother was at the front of the security line now, waving at us with the patience of someone who has navigated between 2 people she loves for 20 years and has developed considerable tolerance for the time it takes. My father looked at her, then back at me. He said, "I want to understand what you do." I said, "Some of it I can't explain." He said. He nodded. He said, "I mean it. I want to try." I said, "I know." He hugged me. Briefly, the way men hug daughters when they are not practiced at it and are trying to be different from who they have always been. It was real. Then he walked to the security line and stood beside my mother, and they moved through together, and I watched them go until they were past the checkpoint and out of sight. I stood at the edge of the security area for a moment. Then I turned and walked back through the terminal toward the parking lot. The TSA agent was near the entrance when I passed, speaking to a colleague. She caught my eye and nodded. I nodded back. I drove to the Pentagon. I was 7 minutes late for my meeting, which I almost never was, and I apologized to my aide, and we began, and the meeting was fine, and by the time it was over, the airport morning had receded into the background of the day. But it had not receded. I want to describe what the following weeks looked like because they matter to the full picture. My father called me 3 days after he got home. Not a scheduled call. He was not a man who made unscheduled calls for purely personal reasons. He called on a Tuesday evening, which was not our usual call day, and when I answered, he said, "I want to start that conversation about your work. The part you can explain." I said, "Okay." We talked for an hour, and I told him what I could tell him, the broad outlines, the categories of work, the way intelligence functions within the Navy's structure, what a senior intelligence officer actually does in the course of a career. I stayed carefully within what I was able to discuss. He asked good questions, better than I expected, questions that showed he had been thinking about how to ask rather than just what to ask. At one point he asked, "Why didn't you ever try to explain this before?" I said I did early on. You redirected every conversation toward when I was going to do something else. He said I did that. I said yes. He said I was wrong. I said yes. He said, I'm saying that because I mean it, not because I'm supposed to. I said, I know the difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how long has that agent been recognizing you at that airport? I said, a few years. He said, a few years. I said, I travel through Dulles regularly. Some of the security staff know regulars. He said, they know you specifically. I said, some of them do. He said, because of your rank. I said, partly, and because of what the rank represents in context. He said, what context? I said, Dad, I do work that matters. I've been doing it for 20 years. The context is the work. He was quiet again. He said, I said, shut up and stop embarrassing us. I said, I know, he said, in front of someone who knew exactly who. I said, yes. He said, I've been embarrassed by the wrong things for a long time. That was exactly right. I told him so. He said, I'm going to keep calling if that's all right. I said, it's all right. He said, I'm going to keep asking. I said, good. He has kept calling. Not every day, not even every week, but with a regularity that is different from the regularity of before, different in quality, in the presence behind it, in the questions that arrive when he does. He came to Washington again in March. We went to dinner. He asked if he could see where I worked, and I explained that he couldn't, that the building required clearances he didn't have, that the nature of my position meant that a family visit wasn't something I could arrange. He accepted this without frustration, which was itself different from before. He said, I understand why I can't. I said, that's new. He said, yes, it is. My mother told me in a separate call that he had been different since January, that he had looked up the ranks and structure of the Navy, that he had read several articles about naval intelligence that were publicly available, that he had asked her once why she had never pushed him harder to understand what I was doing. She said he hadn't waited for her answer. He had said, because I didn't want to understand it, and that was my failure. I don't have a clean resolution. My father and I are in the process of building something different from what we had, and that process is not finished and may not be finished for a long time. 20 years of a settled misunderstanding does not dissolve in a Tuesday morning at an airport, however significant that morning turns out to be, but it can begin there. It can begin with a woman in a blue uniform who said 4 words in a tone that asked nothing and explained everything, and with a father who heard those words from 2 feet away and understood for the first time that they referred to someone he had been looking at wrong. Ma'am, right this way. 4 words, 20 years. The difference between them was not a confrontation or a revelation or anything I had arranged. It was a Tuesday morning, a uniform, and a woman doing her job who happened to know my name. I am 38 years old. I am a captain in the United States Navy. I have been serving for 20 years in ways my father is only beginning to understand. I have a father who is asking questions he should have asked 20 years ago and who is, in his imperfect way, trying to close the distance between the story he told himself and the one that was actually true. I have a memory of standing at an airport entrance while a woman in a blue uniform said 4 words that cost her nothing and changed everything. And I have the knowledge, which I carry every day regardless of who recognizes it in a public space, that the work was always real. It did not need an airport to prove it, but I am glad on some mornings that it did. There is something I want to add that I held back from the main telling because I wasn't sure how to frame it without it becoming about something other than what it actually was. About 2 months after the airport morning, I had a conversation with my mother that I have thought about many times since. She called on a Sunday evening, the way she always did, and we talked about ordinary things for the first 20 minutes. How was work? How was the weather in Richmond? What was happening with my cousins? And then, with the particular careful timing of someone who has been waiting for the right moment, she said, Can I tell you something about your father? I said, yes. She said, I want to tell you something I've never told you, about when you got into the Naval Academy. I said, okay. She said, the night after you told us, after you went to bed, your father and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He was quiet in the way he gets when something has hit him harder than he wants to show. I said, I remember he was disappointed. She said, he was scared. I said, scared of what? She said, of losing you, of you going somewhere he couldn't follow, of watching you become someone he didn't have the framework to understand. I sat with that for a moment. She said, he loved you so much and he had no way to track what you were doing or evaluate it or be proud of it in the ways he knew how to be proud. And his response to that was to tell himself it wasn't worth being proud of. I said, that's a brutal thing to do. She said, I know, I told him so more than once. He didn't hear it, or he heard it and didn't know what to do with it. I said, why are you telling me this now? She said, because since January. And I want you to understand why I think he's actually changing this time, rather than just managing his discomfort the way he always has. I said, what's the difference? She said, the woman at the airport, the way she said your name. I was standing right there and I watched his face. And I think for the first time in 20 years he saw you the way other people see you, not as his daughter who chose the wrong path, just as someone who is clearly, unmistakably someone. She paused. She said he'd never seen that before. You'd always been his daughter first and the other things second, and the other things were evaluated through that lens. The airport was the first time he saw it the other way around. You were the captain first and then separately also his daughter. I said, those two things have always been true simultaneously. She said, I know, but he couldn't see them simultaneously before. He could only see one of them clearly at a time, and the one he chose to see clearly was the one he could evaluate. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. She was right, I think, in a way that I hadn't been able to fully articulate for myself. The dynamic she was describing, my father's inability to hold both pictures at once, the daughter and the officer, without one collapsing the other, was exactly the thing I had been living inside for 20 years without having language for it. He had always been proud of me in the ways he knew how to be proud. He was proud of my academic record. He was proud of how I presented myself. He told people I was intelligent. These were things that fit inside his framework. They were features of a person that he valued and that were visible to him regardless of what I was doing professionally. What he couldn't see was the professional picture. Because seeing it would have required him to admit that there was a whole domain of value, a whole dimension of what it means to build a career and contribute something real to the world, that operated entirely outside the framework he had used to evaluate success for 60 years. The airport woman didn't give him information he didn't have. She gave him a different angle on information he had always been refusing to look at straight on. "Ma'am, right this way." 4 words that said, "This person is known here. This person is recognized. This person has a specific status in a specific world that exists whether or not you have been paying attention to it." He had not been paying attention to it. He started paying attention in January. The other thing I want to say is about the uniform. I have worn a Navy uniform for 20 years. It has become, in the way of things you wear every day, so normal that I rarely think about it as an external fact, the way you stop thinking about your own face because it's simply what you see in the mirror every morning. But uniforms are not invisible to other people. They carry information, rank, service, time, and uniform, the specific ribbons and insignia that encode a career in a language that people within the military read fluently, and people outside it. My father, for 20 years, had looked at my uniform and read the parts he could read, a woman in a military uniform, and had stopped there at the surface without registering what the surface was encoding. The TSA agent read it differently. Not because she had access to my classified record, but because she knew enough of the language to understand what 4 silver stripes meant, and what it meant that someone wearing them came through her checkpoint with the regularity that generated recognition. She read what my father had been declining to read for 20 years, and she said it out loud in front of him in a way that made it impossible to continue not reading it. I am not angry at my father for 20. I want to be honest about that because the story might suggest a bitterness I don't actually carry. I made choices 20 years ago that created the conditions for everything that followed, and one of those conditions was a career that my father genuinely could not evaluate using the tools he had. He was not pretending not to see it. He actually couldn't see it, in the way that people genuinely cannot see things that exist outside their frameworks of understanding. Not the acute exhaustion of someone who has just been through something, the slow, settled tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has reached a point where the weight is simply part of the landscape. 20 years of having the most significant part of my professional life be invisible to the person whose recognition would have meant the most. 20 years of pivot to Marcus, of the gentle redirection toward when I was going to do something real, of the assessment delivered so regularly that it had become the ambient condition of our relationship rather than a specific thing that was said. I carried it. I built my career inside it. I became within it someone that a TSA agent recognized by name. And then one Tuesday morning in January, my father said, "Shut up and stop embarrassing us" at an airport entrance. And 40 steps later, a woman in a blue uniform said 4 words and the weight shifted. Not lifted. Shifted. I am still carrying some of it. I expect I will carry some version of it for a long time. 20 years does not resolve in 6 months, even 6 months of genuine effort and real conversation and a father who is asking questions. But it shifted, something real changed. And sometimes a shift is the beginning of a different weight, one that is easier to carry because someone is finally carrying it alongside you. My father called last week. We talked for 45 minutes. He asked about my work, the parts I could share. He asked about my team, about what leadership at my level required, about how intelligence was structured in the Navy's current command environment. He asked good questions. At the end of the call, he said, "I want to come back to Washington in the spring if you have time." I said, "I'll make time." He said, "Good." He said, "Sarah." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm proud of you. I should have been saying it out loud for 20 years. I'm saying it now because it's true and because you deserve to hear it in those words, not just implied or assumed." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know." We said goodbye. I put the phone down and sat. I thought about the Naval Academy and the kitchen table and the coffee cup he had put down so carefully. I thought about 20 years of the redirect and the pivot and the gentle, persistent assessment that I had chosen wrong. I thought about 6 deployments and 4 medals and a senior leadership program and everything else that had accumulated in the space between that kitchen and this office. I thought about a woman in a blue uniform who said 4 words on a Tuesday morning and changed the angle of a conversation that had been running in the wrong direction for 20 years. "Ma'am, right this way. I am 38 years old. I am right where I always was. It just took my father this long to find the way."